CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Beginkosi Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment here at the Wits Business School. Today I'm very excited and happy to be joined by Professor David Everatt. David, you are welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I want to do a formal introduction, but I think as we go along, we'll get to know you. But I think to be fair, David is the former head of school here at the First School of Governance, also the former director of CARES, and he has had lots of experience doing research, teaching, among others. But David, I want to start maybe where we are, which is here at the Wits Business School. The Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment focuses a lot on research and teaching on philanthropy. The first time I think I got to know about you was when you had just published together with others some work on South Africa, a nation of givers. And I think that was a huge project organized and done, I think, through the collaboration with other several scholars. I think that became one of the seminal works for us here at the center, and most of our students use that. Since then, and I know you've been involved in other forms of research other than just philanthropy. What would you say has been the state, or what do you see as the state of philanthropy in South Africa today?
Philanthropy or research into it?
Both.
I suppose I'm not sure that there's been, what we did was the first attempt to do as comprehensive a study as we could, quantitative, qualitative. We oversampled minority religions like Hindu and Muslim and Buddhist because we believed there was a strong religious input into giving. And we deliberately moved away from the notion of philanthropy into giving, what Alan Fowler would call gifting.
Yeah.
Because at some level, and I've thought about this quite a lot since we did, so we came out with wonderful results in the sense it showed that, as you said, it was called the nation of givers, and it showed that people gave, and people from every walk of life gave whatever they could, whether it was time or goods or money or assistance. And the more I've thought about it, and you and I have co-supervised students and we've individually supervised others, the more I worry that we keep coming back to the notion of philanthropy. We keep arguing against the corporatization of philanthropy. We keep arguing for the indigenization of philanthropy. Excuse me, all of which are completely appropriate points. But I think much research tends to push you towards the group.
Yeah.
What is the nation doing? What is the province doing? What are the poor doing? And it's very, not very far from being trendy to say, take it down to the level of the individual. Because I think giving is the most profound thing you can do, particularly right now in this globalized capitalist world that monetizes everything. There is no good deed that is not recognized, put on TikTok, made into a campaign, made into my next way of earning money. And I think when people simply, giving means voluntarily relinquishing ownership of something with no expectation of a return. And I think that's a profound act. It's almost an anti-capitalist act, because it's saying, I can do something for someone else, and we don't spend enough time looking at the transformative power on the giver or on the recipient. We try to get the scale, the amount, the depth, the variety. But I think it's that one-to-one relationship that is very elusive, and it's very difficult to try and tie down what happens at that moment. But I think it's a really, transformative is the word, because if you relinquish ownership in a world that says, hang on to everything you've got and get more, amass more, keep it, it's a really important thing to do, and you give it to someone who is in need, and they receive it not as part of a TV show with cameras on them, and I must be grateful, and all that stuff. I think that relationship is incredibly intimate. It's incredibly difficult to get to, but I think that's where we need to try and be, because there's an important discourse about African giving and gifting and the communalism versus, I mean, I
Yeah.
think all of that's important. But within that, there are individuals doing things for the good of others, not for the good of themselves. And in this particular moment in history, I think that's just a profound thing.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know enough to say that this is true, but I don't feel that we're doing enough digging down to that level.
Yeah.
We're still at the macro or the meso level, but that micro level is really where I'd want us to be.
Yeah. I mean, I do agree and concur because, I mean, if I look at all our research projects at the moment, including some that have been done by others elsewhere, they've really been at that macro or even meso level. And we haven't really gone down to the individual. I think there are probably a couple of 1 or 2 case studies we have done where we are looking at an individual and how their giving transforms others or how it also changes them. But I think we need more like that. But in your case, David, I'm just interested to know what brought you into the philanthropy space and what has been your journey so far in this philanthropy? Because everyone is either a philanthropist or a recipient of philanthropy in one form or the other.
I mean, to be honest, I got into it because, the Centre for Civil Society down at UKZN put out a tender for this big study. Adam Habib was then, who became the Vice Chancellor here, he was then the director. And I was then running an outfit called Strategy and Tactics, and we won the bid. And so it was a very steep learning curve. I mean, that's when I had to read all my Alan Fowler and everyone else.
Yeah.
And I think that's how we got into it. And we immediately, because we were trying to talk about what resources are available for development, we were not talking about philanthropy. And I thought that even though we had philanthropists in the room and we had people from big philanthropic organizations advising us, no one used the word. And I think that was an incredibly useful way into the space because I didn't come in through philanthropy.
Yeah.
And we never mentioned, we just didn't use the word. Not on some kind of principle, it just wasn't what we were doing. We were looking at giving and how you mobilize resources for development, particularly to help the poor. And so that's why we did the big study and the quals and the quants and the big national survey. And I think that's why I end up with the comments I made previously, because if you don't come in through the lens of philanthropy, but you come in, a big baseline survey does operate at the level of many thousands of individual interactions, and you're measuring those interactions and then cascading them into a bigger figure. That's where I've started, and that's kind of where I've stuck. So in some of the work that we've done together and that I've done separately, I try and look for people who are trying to put a different spin on this.
Yeah.
As I said earlier, I think we've done the argument that Western-style philanthropy is corporatized and it can do good work, but there seems always to be a kickback. There's always self-interest operating as well. There's always, flags and banners and whistles and big handshakes and ribbons to be cut, which makes it very, very not very different from politics. Where people also want to cut ribbons and be photographed for doing it. So that's much more about me, the giver. Look how I am, and it's also me, the big important giver. And as I said earlier, I think the journey. I know we're all on journeys now in this world. But the journey is continually trying to push us away from that big razzmatazz stuff. Important as it is, it's not to write it off. They do really good work. It's just I'm not interested in it. Because I think in Africa, people consistently give. I mean, consistently meaning on a daily basis, they are giving. And that we still don't understand anywhere near well enough. And if we do, I mean, my study was a dip in the water. The complexities just of South Africa, let alone the rest of the continent. When I do a lot of work now in informal settlements, the level of mutual support, of giving when you don't have, of sharing, of households households made up of people who are living in different shacks but come together to eat, to share what little they have. That's the fabric of our society. And I think people have written of, oh, you're poor, oh, you're informal, and that label is enough. I've done enough. And it's profoundly wrong. And the more you unstitch those and look behind the facade of that's just a township, that's just what used to be called a squatter camp, They're very pejorative labels, and they tell us nothing. So my work now is very much in the inner city, in the captured buildings, where we have people from all over Africa and the subcontinent living in these appalling conditions and trying to find ways of surviving through mutuality, through trying to, while they're being rack-rented by appalling landlords, there is crime everywhere, there are drug dealers everywhere, but it's also in the inner city, and they found a place near to where their work is, and it's convenient if it's also appalling. And we're trying to understand and see what you can do to help by providing, so for example, this university, because we have a big medical school, all the med students do practical work where any student at Wits can go into the Solomon Mkhlangu concourse and get a full battery of tests. Everything, HIV, cholesterol, BMI, doesn't matter. Oral health, the lot. And so we've now negotiated thankfully with the senior lecturer in charge, Anae Orchard, that we can open that to the Hillbrow residents. Because for the students doing the work, they get grades for this, it's their practical. But so much better to be able to do it on people from all over Africa who may not be very articulate in English, may never have been tested before. And suddenly it's free. You know, that's the key part. So you go in and you get this full package of services, you get the referrals you need, if you need any. And for me, I want to watch the students as they do that, because you know, student to student is one set of relationships, and it's a fairly easy one. I'm a med student, you're just a Wits student. But when I'm suddenly dealing with possibly 60, 70-year-olds from DRC who are living in Hillbrow and have never been, or for 20 years, say, have not been to a doctor, that's a whole different way of relating. And I think, again, it's this notion of both sides being changed. Another example is it's all part of this. We're running something called an HDSS, a health demographic surveillance site. So we measure this population in a given space, in this case Hillbrow, every year, 3 times a year, and it goes on forever in theory. And we're in an informal settlement in Malusi. But down at UJ, and it's a partnership between University of Johannesburg, Wits, and University of Pretoria. At University of Johannesburg, because they don't have a med school, but they do have ophthalmologists, they get people to come from southern Hillbrow to bring old Coke bottles, because they do an eye test, sometimes for the first time in people's lives. They then recycle the plastic bottles through their 3D printer and print you glasses there and then. And you walk out with glasses. And these are people who have never had an eye test in their lives. And also, sorry, the final part is the design of the glass. So if you look at most glasses, they're designed for white northern people. That's what glasses are designed for. They're not designed for African faces. And so the design students at UJ have designed a whole new way of putting glasses on African faces. And so, you know, it's trying to show people who are living in these appalling conditions that giving happens. And it doesn't come with strings attached. I suppose the string that's attached is you're part of our project, and we talk to you and you give us data. But the notion that you can just give for free to help someone who's worse off than you, or who simply needs it. That, I think, infuses. So that early study, the one the Nation of Givers, it's left me with this continual search for that moment to see how it transforms both sides.
Wow. So David, you see, as you were speaking, I was thinking, you know, we probably haven't done it here, and maybe over time, because of the center and the programs we're offering. When I went to do a fellowship at Indiana, I realized that a number of students who were doing medicine, engineering, etc., were actually taking a module on philanthropy. And I asked myself, why? Because you are studying medicine and engineering. Of course, at that time, they were thinking, maybe later in life, I want to start a philanthropic outfit or whatever it is. But what you are describing now, I mean, there's a benefit to the recipients, the people from Hillbrow, but also to the student who is actually giving, because it means they are being shaped immediately as they are doing that around what it means to be human to human, etc., etc. But you know what is also fascinating is that when you and the team were doing that research, I'm not aware of anyone who had even done anything of that nature in the African continent. So you're probably the first people to do research on philanthropy. But none of you had been trained in what was called philanthropy.
Not at all.
Not at all. But look at where we are now. We are theorizing almost everything that you are saying now. You can actually theorize it and locate it within the frames of philanthropy, even if we may not want to use that word. And so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about the future of philanthropic studies, or the future of studies that are related to this very thing or being that we're discussing now, where we are actually looking at the multidisciplinarity, medicine, engineering, but also the relationships with the surrounding communities. And the work that you are doing in the inner city sounds very, very much central to this thinking.
I mean, I think there are two answers. On the academic front, and I've discovered this by accident, WITS hosts something called the Gauteng City Region Observatory, which I used to run.
Yeah.
But I've seen in their recent surveys, long since I've left, they now ask questions about giving and volunteering time for a charity. And I thought that's very interesting because I didn't put those questions in. So suddenly they've picked up on this. So they're now measuring this, every 2 years for the whole city region. So I think we certainly started something, and we were profoundly undertrained and underqualified. And that study was incredible in what it taught us, because I think we went in, because we were trying to count every type of giving, including if you give a sandwich to someone at a traffic light, it was everything. We didn't know what we would come out with. And I think we worried that we would come out with, because we're a very polarized society, particularly across racial lines, but also class lines, which are increasingly racialized as well, etc. We thought that we'd come up with a lot of suspicion, with people giving only to their own, I'll give to people like me. And we were completely wrong. I mean, in every way we were wrong. And I think that was an incredible eye-opener for us as researchers and as academics. And my main colleague on that is an actuary, Gitesh Solanki, who was crunching the numbers. And he was saying, I don't believe this is amazing. And it was, you could see it really transforming him, because actuaries really spend time with normal people. Forgive me, actuaries, wherever you are. The numbers are much more exciting to them. And I think and when we took it back to Adam Habib and the whole team, they were enthralled by this, because they were doing actual philanthropy. They were counting, what is the Pick and Pay Foundation giving? What is then Raymond Ackerman doing? Were black philanthropists doing the same as white philanthropists? They were doing very much the work on philanthropy with a capital P. And we were not mentioning the word at all. And we found that ordinary people are mobilizing so much more. If you put a rand value to it, which we had to, because that's how you do it, mobilized far more than the entire philanthropic community put together. This is before you count in the Gates and the big boys. But just the South African philanthropy was quite small. And I think your center has been incredibly important in allowing students to pursue this as a dedicated line of inquiry. Because before CAPSI arrived, there were one or two academics. Obviously, there was Alan Fowler. There was sort of me, but I don't claim to be an expert in the field. One or two others, but really you had nowhere to go. You looked for a sociologist maybe, or an anthropologist who could supervise you. You were a bit lost. And now even when I supervise students who are not your students, they've come here first. And they've used your materials, they've spoken to your colleagues, they've spoken to your other students, and they get a sense of the world and the fact that they're not alone, that this is a body of study, that there are lots of things to refer to. And I think in that way, if you model the two together, which is us trying to measure what's happening at grassroots level, and then you combining that with a frank look at philanthropy with the capital P, that's exactly where people need to be. Because I don't think you can keep doing these, what are ordinary people doing? You can do it, but at some level, it has to have a point. Because it's my job, I can continually look at it. Because I'm not looking at it for philanthropic reasons. I'm saying, how do people survive in really tough circumstances? And the answer is giving. And that for me is what matters, is that you don't have to come through philanthropy to end up with the conclusion that giving and sharing is what keeps us alive. And of course, as all of your work says, the heart of philanthropy in Africa is Ubuntu. And that's what we see everywhere we go. We're not looking for it. So I haven't got a kind of philanthropic hat on. I'm not trying to find it. But the more, and because my work is always amongst poor communities, it just screams back at us.
Yeah.
This is what we're doing. This is
Yeah.
how we survive.
Yeah.
So I think that's stitching that together. I think you would find data in almost any field. And I suspect the engineers in America maybe were being trained because in America there's a much more of an expectation that you will give back in this very formal way.
Yeah.
But it's fantastic that they
Yeah.
even have that consciousness.
Yeah.
I think here it's really through academics having a more open mind to transforming their students.
Yeah.
Rather than thinking, I'll just teach them and then I'll let them go in the world and then they must find their own way. I think, you know, the example of the med students doing this work for Hillbrow residents, that really will, I think, transform them in a profound way because, you know, if I'm doing it to a fellow student, we can joke. We're in the same kind of class position, the same everything position.
Yeah.
But when you have to relate to very, very different people who may be very scared of you and deeply suspicious of what's going on and scared of needles and did not, they may have volunteered, but they know they need it. It's not like a, you know, middle-class Wit student kind of strolling through. I think those kinds of encounters are really important. And the more that happens, and it happens a lot, so we're able to mobilize students from all sorts of disciplines because increasingly universities are saying, you must do some field work as part of your degree. And so through our HDSS, we've taken a whole lot of honours students from UJ and we've used them as field workers. So they now understand what informed consent means. Getting into a Hillbrow flat, which is captured and guarded by men with guns, is fairly transformative by itself. But then you have to negotiate informed consent with someone who's very nervous. And I think those are the moments where students really learn. And they learn about the fabric of society, and that fabric is about sharing and giving.
And also they confront humanity because at times going to the field to do research, we all just fill the paperwork for ethics application. But what you're describing is transformational because not only are you just getting an ethics approved, but you also confront humanity and you understand. So David, talking about the impact that research has, I was reading somewhere that your work on youth studies was actually used several times by Nelson Mandela at the United Nations. And I was sitting there thinking, wait a minute, this is impact. I mean, for that kind of work to end up in those global forums. Let's talk about that part of work, but also what has changed since then when you look at the demographics and the youth conditions today.
Well, I have to say that Mandela was very kind to a lot of my work. So I woke up one night quite late and for some reason turned on the TV, and of course American time, it was the UN sitting. And Mandela was reading one of my reports into the record. And I went scarlet in embarrassment. I think it was a particular moment in South Africa's history. And Mandela himself, who I worked with at a political level, because we did the election research for him as well, was incredibly open to research, to data. He's the only, and I'll make this about him briefly. You know, we run, obviously, when you do polling, you run a lot of focus groups. Mandela's the only president who sat through a focus group. And what we did is we took him down to Durban, and we got a group of Inkatha-supporting, ANC-hating African men about 45 years old. And this was at the height of the violence between 1990 and 1994. And he sat behind this one-way mirror where he could see them, and obviously they didn't know he was there. And for 2 hours, he watched them insulting him. That's all they did. They were saying, who is this stupid old man? He doesn't know how the world works. Put him on his farm. He mustn't pretend he can run it. And he just took it. I mean, he didn't look very happy, but he just listened. And for the next 3 or 4 months of the campaign, he would start by saying, I know what you think of me. And he would start quoting these guys from the focus group. And, you know, he was so open to, not just to people, but to really negative views of himself. And he could accommodate that and learn from it and move on. And I think that for the youth, it was the same thing. So we did almost immediately after 1990, Sheila Sisulu, from the Sisulu family, of course, really began to push on the notion of marginalized youth. Because by then, young people had been heavily involved in consumer boycotts, in necklacing, and all sorts of violence that was attendant on the end of apartheid. And they've been written off, the lost generation. They've gone. And lost generation means we give up on you. You're lost. And Sheila got together with the Catholic bishops and the South African Council of Churches. And of course, if you're a believer, then no one can ever be lost, because spiritually we can always bring you back. And so we did, again, I mean, I do big surveys for people. We did a very big survey of youth from all over the country, including the so-called Bantustans and all the other apartheid nonsense that existed. And what we were able to show was that despite all of these conditions, young people were so full of energy and optimism and hope. There was a 5% group who were completely off the chart, who we feared would end up in prison, and I suspect they did. They just had extreme views on everything, and they had really been destroyed by apartheid. And they were overwhelmingly African youth. I mean, there were no whites featuring there, which showed the inequalities we went through. And that's the work that Mandela really picked up on. You know, he didn't do well in the sense that we were also talking very much about HIV/AIDS. And he was very resistant to talking about sex and AIDS, as most leaders were at that time. And so we were quite hard on him to make speeches about that. And it took a few years, and we took some hits. But he understood that you've got to see youth as an investment because they are so, as yet, so undamaged. You know, they are so optimistic, they're so full of energy. They obviously have their own views. They're not all wonderful human beings. They are who they are. But they haven't yet been beaten down by reality. And he's the only president who said, bring the age of voting down to 16. Because if we let youngsters do everything else, why are we not letting them vote? And he was laughed out of this. Again, it was this silly old man. Why is he saying that? Well, why wouldn't we let 16-year-olds vote? I mean, we let them do everything else. I mean, they can have sex. They can do anything. Why is voting? Right to vote, suddenly it's only for adults. And it is. The one thing that Mandela didn't agree with us on was, his view was, we will sort out the politics. We, the old men. And we were saying, no, democratize the politics now. And his message was, go back to school. And he meant it nicely, go get qualified and, you can run the rest of South Africa. But it was this notion that politics is old men and old women. And that, unfortunately, is something we've never managed to break. And I think that's what youth have to break open. Because as long as they allow our politics to be a gerontocracy, these old people making decisions for and about young people, they're never going to get the breaks they need. And I think that's why I worry when I see so many young people not registering to vote, not voting, not really caring about the electoral system. They're right, it doesn't help them. But it'll keep not helping them if they don't get involved. And that for me, and we've got an election in less than a week's time. That for me is a critical area for youth, to really become, not just be politicized, but be political. Get involved, vote, change the system to suit you. If they don't do it, I can promise you no one will do it for them.
I mean, I can't but ignore the fact that you are one of the leading voices when it comes to polling, but also the electoral democracy. I mean, since the time that you are describing, when Mandela was listening to people describe or call him names, to today, there's been a plethora of, I would say, political parties. I mean, there's several of them now compared to then. Is that a good thing, or is that something that we should be worried about? I mean, we are about to get, to go into the election next week.
So, so I have to put my political hat on when I answer that. I can't pretend not to be. So I have a piece that's actually coming out as we speak, or it's out already, in which I basically complain that the ANC is clearly in this kind of stately decline. It's not going to make 50% this election. In other words, the ANC is going to lose the election. But the ANC remains the dominant party in every other way. It won't be the 50% plus one party. And in other words, the opposition has lost a critical moment, because if they would stop being, we have 70 or 71 parties fighting this election on Wednesday next week. In other words, they're splintering the vote in any number of ways. And that's not to say you shouldn't have a party if you feel like having one. But as the opposition, you have to be strategic. You have to say, hang on, if the ANC is this weak, surely there is a strategic moment for us to put aside a lot of our very petty differences that are based on ego and spats we've had in public, and I don't like you because you don't like him, and and just grow up a little bit. and put together an opposition that can give the ANC a run for
Yeah.
its money.
Yeah.
And they have failed completely.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
ANC will continue to dictate the terms of coalitions because the opposition has fallen apart.
Yeah.
I know some of the opposition parties have worked really hard to get
Yeah.
young people
Yeah.
involved, to go
Yeah.
back to our earlier point. And hopefully maybe in 5 or 10 years, in 1 or 2 elections' time, they'll be important. But I think the notion that 70 parties is an appropriate number to somehow take on the one dominant party
Yeah.
that is now
Yeah.
falling below the 50% mark. It's insane. And they're paying the price
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah.
And I think all of them have had to, you go out saying I'm going to win. Even the formal opposition, the Democratic Alliance, does not say I'm fighting to win.
Yeah.
They say make us an anchor tenant in a broader coalition.
Yeah.
Why do you not have the appetite to beat the ANC? Go out saying I want to win, even if you know you're not going to.
Yeah.
Surely
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
tell your supporters, I can win.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
Yeah.
Get some excitement. So I think it's a transformative moment for politics because people have to grow up a bit and realize actually we could have beaten them.
Yeah.
And we missed that chance.
Yeah.
In 5 years' time, or 3 if you're doing local government, we have to be more strategic because we can beat them now.
Yeah.
We can take them on, not in a coalition. One of us needs to now break away and really make a play for power.
Right.
And if we do it right, we can win.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that after May's election, next Wednesday's election, that's something these parties are going to learn
Yeah.
because a lot of them I think are going to die.
Yeah.
They're just not going to get even 1% of the vote, and it's time for them to go.
Yeah.
But I think it's easy for me to criticize. I think it is an important moment because they really have missed a trick, but I think it's the first time that was ever available to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think they're going to grow up and learn, actually, we need to do strategically far better next time.
So, I mean, when one really looks at it, it's a missed opportunity, like you're saying. It's 30 years of democracy. Everyone is celebrating that. That could have been the moment to actually turn things around.
Exactly.
And really make the best out of it. We're about to wind down, David, but I want to talk a bit about your experiences in the different positions that you have held. You are one of the people with an illustrious career. I was looking at some of the institutions that you have headed, from CARES to the Strategy and Tactics to the Observatory, the City Region, but also here at the school where you were the head of school, the School of Governance. Maybe we can go backwards a bit and start with your time at the realm of the School of Governance. Could we talk a bit about some of the leadership challenges, as well as some of the, because I mean, you are the head of the school. Not only are you leading a team of academics and people who provide operational support, you are also worried about the wellness of students, their experience, but you're also worried about the output that comes out of that, so that at the end of the day, the school is credible, not simply because we are focused on one area, but on all of these things that make an ecosystem. So let's talk about the time that you were head of the school, any of the issues that you could raise as challenges, and some of the things that were your major opportunities that you took.
Well, I mean, so firstly, thank you for the flattery. I'll buy you a cup of coffee afterwards. I was head of school firstly, in terms of the school's life, it had changed direction. So it was changing from a school of public admin to a school of governance. Yeah. That's a profound change. But when I took over, they'd just done like the name change. So we had new letterheads and new logos, but no one really knew. So we had to do a fairly profound sea change of curricula and the academics who could teach it and so on. But we were also there at the time of Fees Must Fall.
Yeah.
And that meant this was not about academics. This was about the students.
Yeah.
However you wanted to play the game. This was the moment when the students said, we're sick and tired of everything you're doing. And we're going to literally knock your doors down and knock your heads together.
Yeah.
And I had students spit at me and call me appalling names. And I got a kicking a couple of times when the students all charged in the gates here on our campus.
I mean, they meant business. I mean,
It was serious. They were not playing games.
Of holding Adam.
Absolutely. And
Adam hostage.
We used to have, a number of my staff were held hostage. We used to have meetings in restaurants, secret meetings in restaurants, the Mike's Kitchen over the road from our school, because the students were barricading everywhere else. But it was a wonderful moment because academics had to then say, am I really committed to the academic project? Because the students are not being quiescent anymore. They're suddenly saying, we've had enough. You're going to listen to us. Obviously, many of them were wrong. I think some of them were slightly insane. But they had a core message, which is, this is an alien institution.
Yeah.
We're not at home.
Yeah.
And I think for many of my academic colleagues, they didn't see anything wrong with the institution. And suddenly these, students were saying things were profoundly wrong. And it was fascinating to watch those who could make the journey through. Because by the time I stood down, or my term ended, COVID had arrived. It was 2020, and so everything changed completely. But a lot of academics disappeared from the system, as did a lot of admin staff who had never even confronted students. And suddenly they had students charging through their offices, throwing bricks through windows, doing some really silly acts, like trying to set whole buildings on fire and so on. It was a really scary moment, but you had to see it through because the students had a message. And of course, they were attacking government as well. So you could join them in the big march on the Union buildings in Pretoria and realize this isn't about them attacking me. There's a deeper problem, and I have to understand that as the head of school, and I have to make my team understand it. So we did what you should do. We wrote a book about it, on trying to put governance in an African perspective, or see governance from an African perspective. And that's what we did. And that's an academic response to a student protest that sustained itself for a good 2 to 3 years. And it was a fascinating time. It was absolutely fascinating. And I think we would have been in a much better spot now if we hadn't had to lock down and go onto online, because that really killed the student movement for a couple of years. And now it's beginning to pick up again. But students should be pushing all the time. If they don't push us, we become lazy. And they push like mad during the Fees Must Fall movement. So it was a fantastic, it was quite scary, but it was a fantastic time to be head of school.
And then, I was also trying to look at what has been the common thread in David's journey from, your first...
I've got a big mouth, that's the common thread.
Other than that, I wanted to also talk a bit about your time at CASE, because I think CASE used to do phenomenal work. And but let's talk a bit about CASE, and then if there are any threads that you want to connect from then to today.
CASE stood for Community Agent for Social Inquiry. It was started by Mark Orkin in the late 80s. I joined, when we all came back in 1990, I joined in 1991, I think late 91 or early 92. CASE was, and Sipho Pichana, who later became terribly important and famous, joined at the same time as me. So firstly, it was after 1990, so you were able to get people coming back from England. I just finished my doctorate at Oxford. Sipho had just finished his doctorate. We were people who had no idea what to do. We didn't even think we were coming back to South Africa because we didn't know 1990 was going to happen. And so there was a real, and I don't include myself in this sentence, there was a real pool of talent to draw on. But the progressive movement was desperate for data because we were so weak on policy, and you need data for policy. And what CASE did was we did big sample surveys or big qualitative outings, but we were big. Everything was done to scale because, South Africa had been fragmented with these Bantustans, and even the National Statistics Agency wouldn't go into Bantustan. It was all this nonsense. And we just cut across that. And I think CASE was so well positioned. We were able to provide any survey that was required. We were the first port of call. It was just a privilege. The first disability baseline, the first gender baseline, the first youth baseline. We were able to provide the kind of policy building blocks for almost everything that happened. And it was just a fantastic privilege. And as the ANC and the UDF moved into government, their needs began to change, and we changed with them. But increasingly, we began to say what you need is monitoring. You need to be looking at what you're doing, not just looking for new data and new policies. You need to now be checking on what you're doing. And CASE at that point didn't want to, they thought that would be too close to government if we were doing monitoring systems, evaluation strategies. And so I left and set up a new agency called Strategy and Tactics. That was in place specifically to do M&E work, particularly for government and for donors. Because, and we've learned it now, if you don't look after your assets, they degrade. And government is too good at running in, doing something, cut a ribbon, move on to some. There's no ribbons to cut when you rehabilitate a sewer. Ministers don't want to be seen. But if you don't rehabilitate the sewer, people don't have sewerage. And so we moved much more into that space. But I think what CASE taught me was politicians are very aware of what's wrong They're very smart because they do have constituents complaining, and they know when you're lying to them as an academic or a researcher. If you come back and say, it's all fine, don't worry, they know you're talking rubbish because they know what the problems are. And I learned very quickly, lead with the bad news. Don't come in saying, look, it's good, but there's a little... Come in saying, this is what's wrong. This is how we fix it. And you fix it by drawing on what's right. And
But
it was the politicians who taught me that. They said, don't soft soap us. Tell us what's wrong, because we know what it is.
But at times you tell them what is wrong, and at times they sit on it. They don't work. Don't work on it, because working on it might actually work against their interests.
That's always.
At the time. And so I think it's good message for most researchers. So that they understand that actually politicians understand what's going on, and so you have to give them the information as it is. What they do with it is another story.
All you can do is be honest to your trade. Come in with the best data you can. Say it as frankly and bluntly as you can, not rudely, just bluntly. And then your job's done. They'll act or they won't.
You know, I have one more question, then we can wrap up. So one is that, I mean, you've been doing all these surveys and longitudinal studies. That takes a lot of patience. And it takes a lot of patience because I really have respect for people who do longitudinal studies, for years and years. I mean, what we're describing has gone on for years and years in Hillbrow. I'm aware of also another study that is done in Mpumalanga at the VEST facility that has been going on for more than 30 years.
Since 1992.
Since 1992.
They're one of our partners in what we do.
And so what are the lessons from staying focused on these longitudinal studies and surveys?
I think what it's taught me is how wrong I've been for so much of the work that I've done. Excuse me. Because what I do, as I've said, is I tend to do big surveys. You go out, you do a snapshot, you come back and you say, that's how the world is. Within measurable error bars. But when you do longitudinal work, you go back to the same person year after year after year. And sometimes only in year 7 or 8, they say to you, actually, because we ask very personal questions, because of health, you have to ask about things like termination of pregnancy, miscarriages, you have to, deaths in the family. The vital statistics are what we're gathering. Sometimes we found 7 years later, a woman will say, actually, I lied to you, I had an abortion. And you're able to backstitch that in time. So it means that because the data are alive all the time. So the survey from 7 years ago is still in the data set. And I think as people learn to trust you, they learn to open up more to you. And your data gets better and better. And so you as an academic may come along and access the data set because it's all free. But I think what we're learning is we can put better and better and better data together. And in a sense, the data almost becomes an end in itself, because you spend so much time trying to get it right. There's very little time to write articles and be clever. But I find that fantastic. That for me is all the training I've done in in surveys is now being applied to this HDSS, where getting the field workers to be full of empathy, to ask really personal questions in a really sympathetic way. We do verbal autopsies when there are deaths in the family. That's a kind of 2.5 hour session where we're trained and we're debriefed by psychologists on how to do this properly, so that you respect the woman who's answering the questions, if it's about a child, or the man if it's about a death in the family, whatever. It's taking field work so further than do a survey, outsource the field work, don't worry about how it's done, just give me the data. This says if you don't worry about every step from design of questionnaire to the day you upload the data, then you're getting it profoundly wrong. And I think what I've learned from this is how often I've got it profoundly wrong throughout my career.
But from what you're saying is that you still also get an opportunity, because your data is live, to actually correct it. So and
that's critical. You never get that chance.
So that's critical. I mean, from what because most of the times people would run a survey, their results are out, and that's what we live with. But in this case, you actually go back and correct the data. And so if I come in now to look at the data that you did 15, 20 years back, I'm looking at the data as it is today, which has been refined over time.
We go back through as we. So it's a whole series of algorithms that does it for us. It's not like we sit there and do it manually. But anything that people tell us is retrospective, it automatically corrects it. And that just means that the data even when we do surveys, we tend, like in the City Region Observatory, we do a quality of life survey every 2 years. It doesn't go to the same people.
Yeah.
It's just another snapshot in time. I think when longitudinal data, where it adds values, we're going to the same people. I'm doing another one across Africa with the MasterCard Foundation, who I know are partners of yours, the HSRC, where we're going to graduates who've had MasterCard scholarships and going back to them year on year on year, trying to understand, and there it's directly your field. They're told you must learn to give back. And we're trying to understand year on year how that changes in their minds as they become more established in their career, as they begin to earn a living, as they move away from being a student. And they are still African students. And they're trying to marry their notions of communalism and giving with a very American kind of give back, philanthropic view of the world. And we like to think we're changing MasterCard a little bit as well. I wouldn't put money on it. But that's another example of longitudinal data where we're able to retrospectively correct what we got wrong. And I think it's incredibly labor intensive. It's not cheap. It's not easy. But I think it's profound to get your data to be alive all the time. That's the gold standard.
So David, I want to end by asking you, other than doing research and engaged in the academic work, what else occupies David?
I swim a lot. I've done 20 mid-mile miles.
Wow.
If that helps. I don't know. I just. What else? I do a lot of politics, unfortunately. So I have my academic work, and all the polling and stuff is done on weekends and evenings. And I'm a happily married man with 2 children, so they tend to occupy me.
Right. Thank you so much, David, for making the time.
Thank you,
I know we have just scratched the surface. I could go on and on and on and on. So thank you so much for making the time, and I'm really excited that you came through. I actually think that there's still a lot that you and I and other colleagues, especially in the philanthropic field, will still need to do, other than just supervising students. Just the work that you just mentioned now around MasterCard and their alumni already speaks to some of the research that you are doing in the philanthropic space. And so I look forward to chatting to you more and also getting to know some of the work that you are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. It was a pleasure.
That was David Everatt, who is currently the professor at the Everatt School of Governance. And as we heard, he has really been through a lot of longitudinal studies, research, but also doing some of the political analysis. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.